Welcome back to Learn with Lakshman. In this video, we'll talk about a short story entitled Search for a Stranger. This short story is written by Gordon Livingston. I am first of all going to read out the whole story so that essence of the story is understood. But before that, I'll just speak about Gordon Livingston. Dr. Gordon Livingston was a Colombian psychiatrist and author. He was born in Memphis, Tennessee. He was the son of Staten Livingston, an orthopedic surgeon and Veterans Administration Hospital chief. And his mother was Bonnie Keegan. He graduated from the US Military Academy and became an infantry officer in the military hospital. His first book, Only Spring, deals with the death of his 6-year-old son from leukemia. The Thing You Think You Cannot Do is a very outstanding book about developing personal virtues. Besides, he has also published the bestseller Too Soon Too Old, Too Late Smart about the inspirational truths in life. His book And Never Stop Dancing discloses the roadblocks and the surprises of life. This was the introduction to the author or the writer of the short story. This is regarded as one of the wonderful short stories written by Gordon Livingston. So let's begin with the story itself. The highly emotional events of that summer were triggered by the most prosaic question. A cousin I was visiting asked me how my work was going. I am a child psychiatrist in Colombia, MD, and I answered his question by telling him about a recent conference where I had headed a workshop on behavior difficulties in adopted children. It concluded that such children may experience a disproportionate number of emotional problems requiring professional help. One of the factors, I said, may be the child's burden of dual identity, made worse by the secrecy surrounding the adoption process. In all states but 4, court and social agencies are permitted to seal the records. When an adopted child tries to find out the truth and comes upon all this secrecy, he often concludes there is something shameful about him. But why do they need to know they are adopted? My cousin asked. It is a very difficult secret to keep, and if a child learns of it from sources other than his parents, there can be psychological damage. Better that he knows the truth from the beginning. I cited case histories, and as the father of 4, I spoke of efforts to be truthful to Michael, our youngest, who was adopted. My cousin shook his head in disbelief. What would you do if you yourself were adopted? Search for my natural parents, I said promptly. Well, start looking, he said. At first, I thought he was joking. When it became evident that he was not, it was as though some unseen fist had struck the blow to the pit of my stomach. I tried to compose myself, forcing deep, even breathing. You all right? My cousin asked. I'm fine, I assured him. I was far from fine. I felt I had lost an important part of my identity. All the basic facts about myself that I had taken for granted were suddenly stripped away. If I was not Scottish-Irish, as I had supposed, what nationality was I? Raised as an only child? Did I actually have brothers and sisters? Who were my natural parents? The alienation the adopted can feel when not prepared for truth and the need of biologic identity were no longer theories, abstractions. They were real problem. They were mine. When I confronted my adoptive father late that night in 1976, mother had died the year before. He looked crushed. We never told you, he said, because we were afraid you would want to meet your real parents and we might lose you. I put my hand on his arm. You and mom are my real parents. You loved me and raised me, and I love you. Nothing can change that. He gave me a grateful, though tremulous smile and said, well, if you feel you must search for them, I'll help you all I can. My birth certificate listed me as being born in Memphis 10 on June 30, 1938. Dad thought the birth date was correct, but could not remember the name of Memphis agency that had arranged the adoption. He and mother lived in Detroit at the time and had gone to Memphis with friends named Martins, who had also adopted a child. It was a thin lead, but after a dozen phone calls, I traced the Martins to California and learned from them the agency was the Tennessee Children's Home Society. There was no phone listing for such an agency, so I wrote to the Tennessee Department of Public Welfare and asked permission to see the records of Tennessee Children's Home Society. The reply was brief. The Tennessee adoption law prohibits the reopening of closed adoption records except upon an order from the court in which the adoption was granted. I arranged with colleagues to care for my patients during my absence, then drove to Laurel MD Airport, where I hangared my single-engine Cessna airplane. After takeoff, I set a course towards Memphis 800 miles west-southwards. As I watched the highways and farms and rivers and cities stretched to the horizon, I realized how remote the chance was of finding my mother. In that vast land, I sought a single person whose face I would not recognize, whose name I did not know. There was no record of Tennessee Children's Home Society in Memphis City Hall. I went to a local newspaper and asked to see their back issues. I almost wished I hadn't, for I discovered that in the fall of 1950, the home had been put out of business by court order. The front page story revealed the director had been selling children for high fees and pocketing the money. She had marketed the babies of unwed mother, prostitutes, and mental patients. I stared hard at the paper. In which of these categories was I? The next day, I engaged a local lawyer to help in search. 24 hours later, he telephoned. I found you in the Bureau of Vital Statistics, he said. Your birth name was Donald Alfred Cardle. The sealed records are in Memphis Courthouse. We can try to get a look at them tomorrow. For the rest of that day and a good deal of night, I repeated the name over and over. The next morning, we had a stroke of luck. My lawyer knew the courthouse clerk, and when he casually asked for the record of the adoption proceedings, an envelope was delivered to us. With trembling hands, I removed a legal document and spread it before us. It was an adoption decree, headed Probate Court of Shelby Court, 17th day of August 1940. My mother's name was Anne Simmons Cardle. Nothing about my father. The document stated that the child is destitute and helpless, that the father has abandoned the child. This could only mean that I was illegitimate. I felt a rush of sympathy for that unwanted child of so many years ago. I'd like a copy of my adoption decree, I said to the lawyer. The clerk, suddenly realizing my identity, grabbed the paper out of my hands. Only the judge can give you permission to see this, she said sharply, but I had seen enough. Armed with the name, my lawyer made the rounds of the hospitals and finally found a listing of my mother's admission. She was a school teacher from Mississippi. Again, I was in the air, heading south towards Jackson, the capital of Mississippi. When I landed, I hired a car and asked directions to the Department of Education. But though I was given complete access to the files, at the end of a long day's work, I had found no Ann Cardle in the listing of teachers. Discouraged, I started to leave the dusty stacks when I noticed an old filing case marked Academic Records. I opened it and found yellowed manila folders, one of which carried neatly lettered words, Ann Simmons Cardle. It revealed that my mother had received a master's degree in education in 1952 and gave the name of college where she had earned it. From a phone booth, I called the college's alumni office and asked if Ann Cardle's address was on their current alumni letter mailing list. "I'm sorry, sir, but the last correspondence this office had from Miss Cardle was over 10 years ago from Natchez. She may be deceased." Back at the airport, I filed my flight plan for Natchez. The phone book at the Natchez airport showed 6 Cardles, none of them Ann. The first one listed was Alfred Cardle Jr. When he answered the phone, I said, "My mother knew an Ann Cardle back in college. I promised her that if I ever came to Natchez, I'd look her up." "Did you ever know an Ann Cardle?" "She's my aunt," he replied. "She lives in Savannah." "I'd appreciate her address," I said as calmly as I could. "I just may be in Savannah sometime soon." It was 7 in the evening when I landed in Savannah, parked the Cessna, and stepped into the phone booth. The phone rang twice. "Hello? Ann Cardle?" I asked. "Yes." "Miss Cardle, my name is Gordon Livingston. I have thought a good deal about how to put this, but I haven't come up with any way but simply to say it. I am your son. I have come a long way. I would very much like to meet you." There was a pause before she answered in southern accent, which unaccountably surprised me. "Yes," she said. "There are many things I'd like to talk to you about." When I arrived at the address, I found an apartment on well-groomed street. In response to my knock, the door opened and there stood an attractive and dignified woman in her 60s. From behind glasses, she looked at me cautiously. She was a stranger. "Please come in," she said. Coffee had been made, and when I accepted the cup, I heard the china make a tinkling sound in her trembling hands. After some awkward amenities, I said that I'd like to know about her and my father. She began to speak in low, guarded voice. She had been born in 1912 to a farm family in Mississippi. By frugal living, her parents were able to send her to college. She taught first and third grades in Mississippi for 20 years, and then retired to take a job as an administrator in the school systems of neighboring state. When she began to speak of my birth, her voice was full of emotion. Back in those days in small southern community, the disgrace of being pregnant and unmarried, it was more than I could face, more than I could ask my family to face. She continued in a monotone. "It was during my first year of teaching. Your father was older, 28, a most handsome man, a marvelous dancer. He was the only man I ever loved before or since. When I learned I was pregnant, I begged him to marry me and give baby a clear name. He said we'd have to think about things. I never saw him again. I went to Memphis to have my baby, and no one back home ever knew anything about it. 3 years ago, I read that he, your father, died of cancer." That was the end of the story, the end of my search. It was not an unusual story in many ways. A one-sided love affair, a young woman bereft and with child. But this was our story, hers and mine. And across the years, I could feel the shame and confusion of that young school teacher as she faced the decision which would separate her from me. Her feelings of remorse were deep. It's been the bitter regret of my life that I lost my baby because of my own cowardice, she said. But I had my own ways of keeping track of your development as a child. I knew that in 1944 you would be 6 years old and in the first grade. I could hardly wait for my own class of 44. When I gave IQ tests, I hoped the brightest one was you. When I comforted a defeated child, I feared that he might be you. A remembering smile touched her face. You did everything at top speed that year. You were aggressive yet vulnerable and easily wounded by harsh words. I learned that you needed an atmosphere of tolerance and love. I tried to give it to you by giving it to all those children. It was an illusion, of course, but I half believed it, and when it became time for me to say goodbye to that class in the spring, I felt sick with guilt. It was as if I were abandoning you the second time. Then, during the following winter, there came the news that the third grade teacher was retiring. I immediately petitioned the school board for the transfer to the grade, and it was granted. I would again be your teacher, this time when you were 8. That year, as I watched you mature, I was proud that you were becoming your own man, but also hurt that the ties between us were loosening. By the end of that year, I was determined to put you out of my mind, for I knew I was being selfish. Still, I always wanted my child back. I grew older. I prayed that I would one day meet him as a man, so I could ask his forgiveness. My throat tightened and tears stung my eyes. Forgive her? The very idea that I should judge her was outrageous. I stood woodenly, immobilized by my emotions. She made the first move. Slowly, humbly, she held out her arms. For the first time in 37 years, I touched my mother, and she touched me. This is the end of the story. It's a wonderful story. It touches us emotionally. It gives us emotional appeal. So I feel this is one of the wonderful short stories written by Gordon Livingston.